Hello, everybody. We are having quite a food week on Keen On this week. Earlier this week, we had the noted and very troublesome regenerative farmer from Western Virginia, Joel Salatin, on the show. He's from Polyface Farms, very anti-industrial, according to their website, healing the land one bite at a time. Salatin describes himself as the lunatic farmer, very much against the industrial capitalist nature of farming in America. And then we also had the food blogger and writer Nicola Twiley on the show. She is the author of an interesting new book, Frostbite: How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves. And in fact, in our conversation, Twiley argued that it was refrigeration that is the principle, the central cause for global warming. So if we could get away from that, from our refrigerated industrial food economy, maybe we could address also our global warming crisis. Our third guest in this theme is Andrea Freeman. She's a law professor and she has a new book out, Ruin Their Crops on the Ground: The Politics of Food in the United States, from the Trail of Tears to School Lunch. Andrea is joining us from Los Angeles. Andrea, what is it about food these days? Why is everyone writing books about the politics of food?
Well, politics of food are so important. We eat food every day, and food is responsible for our health and our productivity, and food is the biggest killer. It is the number one cause of preventable deaths in the United States. So it's a matter of life and death.
Your promotional material, at least for your book, Ruin Their Crops, describes the book as the fast food nation for, let me just read this out just to be clear about what they're saying. The fast food nation for the Black Lives Matter era. What exactly does that mean?
It means that the book exposes how corporate interests and profits dominate our food systems, our food laws and policies in a way that has a racially disparate effect on not just Black people, Indigenous people, Latina people, a lot of people who are marginalized either by race or class or gender. And so the book combines the idea of looking underneath what's happening in food policy and racial justice.
I'm guessing that your politics are slightly different from the libertarianism of Joel Salatin. He's basically opposed to the state in any way in terms of its ability to control farming in the United States. Are you suggesting in your book that there's some sort of conspiracy, consciously or otherwise, between capitalism and the American state?
Yeah. So I don't know if conspiracy can be unconscious. Do you know what I mean? I think conspiracy implies that people are plotting together, right? But I would say that in the past, there has been very deliberate acts to sabotage people's food and nutrition, and that the policies that started back then have continued into the present. So now I don't think we have anyone kind of rubbing their hands together and saying, let's kill off all these unwanted people, but the effect is the same.
You begin, or certainly the narrative in some ways begins, with one of the supposed heroes of American history, perhaps the central founding father, George Washington. What did Washington do when it came to food politics?
So the quote that the title is based on comes from him, he said, ruin their crops in the ground and stop them planting more. And that was in reference to the U.S. policy towards Indigenous people and his command to starve them in order to take their land and displace them and basically eliminate them through food.
I'm not an expert, certainly on Washington or on his food politics or lack of food politics, but isn't that the standard strategy in warfare, that you do whatever you can to defeat people? So if you can, you starve them. If you can, you destroy their farmland.
Yes. However, I would think that, we should not have been at war with people who were just living here when settlers came over from England, that there shouldn't have been these deliberate policies to try to eliminate them because this was their land. And so that it wasn't actually a war, it was just an attempt to take over, steal, colonize.
Are you then suggesting, and we've done many shows on this, that the foundations of the American Republic are rooted in some sort of genocidal policy against native peoples?
That sums it up pretty well.
And going back to the issue of consciousness or unconscious, are you suggesting that men like George Washington, white colonial figures, that they wanted to wipe out indigenous peoples and they used food policy to do this?
Yes.
That's quite an accusation, Andrea. Was this just of Washington or that entire class of founding fathers?
Yeah, I mean, the policy did continue for quite a while. So we have, a series of presidents whose goal is to secure that land for the white settlers that came in and drive indigenous people into certain sections of the country and then take that land for themselves.
I recently was in Monticello. I'm sure you've been there. Many people in our audience, Jefferson's ancestral home, where there was a lot of focus on food policy, cooking, wine. I found actually the whole house and the whole experience slightly chilling. Would you include other founding fathers like Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison in this, what you seem to be presenting as a plot to wipe out indigenous peoples?
Yeah, well, so Jefferson and Monticello is actually in the book as well, but it's in the context of enslaved people and Jefferson's policies around feeding the people that he enslaved at his home there. And so he also was very deliberate about using food in a way that would not provide full nourishment to the people that he enslaved there. And so, he's definitely part of that.
Yeah, what I found about Monticello a little bit chilling, and I'm sure you cover this in the book, is the way in which he fetishized food and wine and fine cooking, and at the same time, of course, used slaves to do so. But are you suggesting that he consciously underfed or starved his slaves?
Yeah. I mean, it didn't suit enslavers to completely starve the people that they enslaved, but just to give them enough food to be able to work, but not enough to be really strong. There was a big fear of rebellion and revolt. So enslavers were very strategic about how they fed people enslaved on their plantations.
How did this sit, Andrea, with the discourse of the Republic, of freedom, of rebellion, of individual rights? Are you suggesting that the whole enterprise, the whole foundations of the American Republic are a sham?
Well, they were for people who were not white males, generally. And the way around that was not to consider those people full people.
So you're suggesting that there is a genocidal quality, at least, to the foundations of the American Republic.
It's true. I would agree with that.
Well, I'm not saying, and I know you are. I'm not.
Wait a second.
Yeah. I mean, it's. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not a enough of a historian to make a judgment one way or the other. It sounds a little conspiratorial. Are you suggesting that these men somehow got together to wipe these people out, as they say?
So I don't know about got together, but for example, speaking about enslavers, they did exchange information through pamphlets and other resources, trying to find that exact, sweet spot of where they could ration out food to accomplish their goals. So, in that sense, I guess you could see that as a conspiracy because it's people, sharing information and not exactly agreeing, but trying to help each other to come to the same kind of level of underfeeding people and preventing them from being able to sustain themselves through things like laws that would forbid hunting and fishing on days when enslaved people might have off, or later sharecroppers might have off. So there was a wider shared intention to keep Black people, whether enslaved or free, out of the economy.
Yeah, it's a terrible indictment. Are you suggesting, and I've heard similar arguments, for example, about British colonialism of Ireland and other European colonial endeavors. Is this uniquely American in your opinion? I mean, you're not a global historian, you're focused on food policy in the US, but is this something you could find in other European state-centric policies towards indigenous peoples of one area or another?
Yeah. Anywhere where people have been colonized or, enslaved, you see the same types of approaches.
Is this a racial thing? I mean, had, I don't know, people of different color skins invaded Europe. I don't know, Muslim peoples in the Middle East invaded Spain or Central Europe. Was this a perpetual theme in global history, or is it just something that white men do, starve everybody else?
Well, race is used to justify these kinds of policies. So, race as a concept is something that is not biologically based. It's not really based on skin color, as you say, or, anything physical or genetic. It's an idea that helps fuel and rationalize policies like this. So race is intertwined with colonialism, subordination through food, and all of the issues that I talk about in the book. But it's not the reason for it. It's something that's a tool that's part of it.
When you say it's not a reason for it, are you suggesting that these people, and perhaps all people throughout history, are driven by power and they want to do away with people who counter their power?
I think that wherever we have or perceive scarce resources, then people want them for themselves. Yes, we want power, we want comfort, we want security, we want privilege, and that does lead to the oppression of others.
We've done a lot of shows, Andrea, on the various crimes against native peoples. We've never done one specifically on this subject. But one of the arguments about native peoples, we heard, not by everyone, but by a number of authors, is that their conception of property, the native peoples of North America in particular, were different from the European colonialist. It wasn't a zero-sum understanding. Is there any truth to that? Was there some sort of cultural misunderstanding between the Europeans and the native peoples of North America?
Absolutely. Indigenous people have a completely different relationship with land. It's not as exploitative. It's more of a fluid give and take kind of relationship. So when English settlers came over and they saw land, they might have, to their eyes, thought, oh, this is not being used, right? It's just sitting here being wasted, if it was a period of time where it wasn't the right time to be, foraging, hunting, whatever at that time, because that it's a cyclical relationship to land and food.
We've done also shows on the histories of the native peoples, and some historians would argue that there were as many wars before the Europeans came as when they did, or after they came, and those wars were always unresolved one way or the other because no one tribe or group was ever powerful enough to conquer the rest of the continent. Are there then, if that's the case, are there any fundamental differences between the native peoples when it comes to power and control and the European colonialists?
Well, it's different to be at war with a neighboring nation because, again, you want their resources or you have some reason, than to come to a land and try to completely eliminate every person who's already living there so you can take it for yourself.
What about, and I know that the Vale of Tears is another shameful chapter in American history. The Trail of Tears is something you focus on. How does your theory explain, particularly 19th century policy, American policy towards Native Americans?
Well, a lot of what justified Indian removal, as you had up there, and the Trail of Tears, was this idea that indigenous people could no longer use the land that they had to feed themselves because it had been destroyed by the United States. And so Jackson put in a policy to say, well, then they have to move. And when people didn't want to move, then again, that all of their food resources were destroyed, so they really had no choice. If they stayed, they would starve. But along the way, many people also starved, and they were promised that when they got to this new land, they would be given rations and they would be fed. And a lot of times those promises did not come through.
And again, in your mind at least, there was a conscious policy to essentially starve the native peoples of North America in this. Particularly, I don't think anyone will defend the Trail of Tears. Right. You mentioned Andrew Jackson. There's a great deal of difference politically between Jackson's populism and the aristocratic republicanism of George Washington. But are you suggesting that Washingtonian and Jacksonian democracy were pretty much the same when it came to starving the native peoples of North America?
Yes, I don't think that they had any differences on that. Their goals were the same.
Was there anyone who opposed this? Were there any founders, white, powerful men who said this is unacceptable, this is immoral, this is against all our principles?
We have some documentation of people working within the administration in different officer positions who would, write or speak and say, this is not right, and, look at what's happening, but nobody who had any power to stop it.
So in a sense, it's even worse, if that's the right word, than the debate about slavery, where there were always white, powerful men, even Jefferson, a slave owner, who recognized that it wasn't morally acceptable.
Yeah. I wouldn't compare colonization and enslavement, because they're different phenomena, and but they have similarities in terms of the way food was used to implement them. So I don't know what's worse or better, but certainly the effects of these colonial policies are still resonating today.
Yeah, and I want to get to the contemporary age after the break. Before we get there, genocide, of course, is a politically charged word. It's thrown around a lot these days, sometimes controversially. Do you have numbers in your book suggesting that the numbers of Native Americans killed by the politics of food, or the politics of the absence of food, of the creation of famine? How many millions of Native Americans were killed by, at least in your view, by state policy?
I don't have those numbers in front of me, but
what would you estimate? I mean, are we talking about hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, millions of Native Americans?
I'm going to go with the middle.
Hundreds of thousands, which is
Yeah.
still an awful lot of people.
Yeah.
What about capitalism, Andrea? I know we'll come to capitalism after the break and the contemporary America. There was a market-based economy in even in the beginnings of American history. Was there an entanglement, perhaps a conspiracy between state policymakers and the market and wealthy merchants, even in the beginnings of American history when it came to the politics of food and starving Native Americans?
There has been throughout time alliances between wealthy merchants and government, actors who can make the kinds of laws that benefit those merchants. So even with limited access to food, then on what became reservations and Indian country, then white sellers were able to come in and profit from that by selling their food. And then that food, which was more of a white kind of food, made people sick.
And perhaps you could be a little bit more explicit. What is a white kind of food?
Like white flour, milk from cows, certain kinds of meats, sugar, right? Things that were not part of the indigenous diet to begin with.
Is that a white food or just a different food?
Well, I think, looking at the United States at that time, that was white food.
But non-whites around the world had cows or sugar, didn't they? I mean, sugar was produced perhaps in a slave economy in the West Indies.
Right. And that.
So are you moralizing food? Are you suggesting there's good and bad food? Or just good and bad food for different groups of people? Are you suggesting that different cultures associate with different foods?
Well, what I'm saying is that, from a medical or nutritional or scientific stance, then there are some foods that are not as good for your body. And so if you're going to eat a lot of white flour and sugar and milk and these things that I've identified as white food in the context of what indigenous people originally ate, then it does lead to diabetes and obesity and a lot of other health problems that were not part of indigenous culture or society before they started eating them.
But aren't those foods bad for everyone?
Yeah. But so what the issue is some people can eat those foods and other foods that are good for them to balance it out. But if you're completely reliant on, for example, in those times, rations that consist only of the bad foods, then you get sick from those rations and you didn't have any other options.
And was there also, coming back to your what I call a conspiracy, maybe you'll describe it something slightly differently, but did policymakers know what they were doing? Are you suggesting that they consciously encouraged or perhaps even forced other peoples, native peoples, to eat bad food?
Yeah. So, for example, in federal Indian boarding schools, part of the policy of forced assimilation and Americanization and all of that was to feed indigenous people white food, which was considered to be superior, civilizing, right? But did not sit well. So, for example, milk, which was not drunk by indigenous people before, was a staple. And most indigenous people can't even digest it because of lactose intolerance. So yes, there were deliberate policies to feed indigenous people white food to try to make them more white.
And in fact, you're an expert on milk. Your previous book was Skimmed: Breastfeeding, Race, and Injustice. Are you suggesting, and again, I keep on asking this question, are you suggesting the white policymakers knew what they were doing? It's one thing to force everyone to eat what you call white food, thinking it's good for you.
Mhm.
But are you suggesting that they knew that this quote unquote white food was bad for natives, so they purposely gave it to them?
Yeah, so milk is a great example of that because we have a lot of documentation from history of people working with indigenous people noting that they did not like to drink cow's milk to give it to their babies. And so scorning that and saying, oh, well, that's terrible and that's going to be so bad for the babies when the opposite was true. And the same with enslaved people. It was early on noted in some of these communications between enslavers that milk was not good for the enslaved people. It would make them sick. It might make it more difficult for them to work.
Yeah, these are very serious accusations, Andrea, but maybe you're right. We are speaking with Andrea Freeman, the author of Ruin Their Crops on the Ground, a very radical position on state policy and the market in terms of indigenous Americans and Americans of different color skins and ethnicities and perhaps social classes. We're going to take a short break. I want to remind everyone that great guests like Andrea Freeman are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, a quarterly journal of politics and culture. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Andrea Freeman to talk about the politics of food in the 20th and 21st century America. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas, it's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Andrea Freeman, the author of Ruin Their Crops on the Ground, a very radical position on American food policy, the politics of food in the United States, from the Trail of Tears to school lunch. Let's fast forward, Andrea. We talked about the the Trail of Tears. We've talked about George Washington. Let's get to the 20th and 21st century. Are you suggesting that this informal or formal alliance between the state and the market continued into the 20th and 21st century when it comes to the politics of food?
Yes, particularly after the 1930s, when during the Depression we saw a new movement to try to support the agricultural industries in the United States. And subsidies towards certain foods were given through the first Farm Bill in 1933. And that kind of kicked off the next almost 100 years of agricultural corporations growing bigger and growing in power and gaining control over food law and policy.
So how does this play out? You're suggesting that during the age of FDR, I think many people understood this was a period where the state helped feed people. There was a great deal of hunger on the land. Are you suggesting that that's the wrong way of thinking about the 1930s?
At the time, it was the right thing to do. It's the way that it evolved after that that became problematic. Because when those subsidies kicked in to try to solve the problem of hunger in the United States, they were focused on crops that could feed a lot of people quickly and just make them full. And so these subsidies went out to certain industries, to soy, to corn, to meat, to milk, to wheat. And over time, what happened is, that problem ended and people got enough to eat again. And we had surpluses of these foods that the USDA then had to get rid of because it was responsible for keeping the prices low and the markets were not allowed to just reflect the demand. So the USDA built up a lot of surpluses, and to try to find somewhere to put them, it developed some nutrition programs like school lunches that became depositories for these surpluses.
So, in other words, the New Deal fed people when they were starving, but once that crisis, perhaps by the 40s or 50s, had been resolved, the state, are you arguing that the state conspired with large ag or large food to deliver bad food into schools? Is that your argument?
That's one way of putting it.
Well, how would you put it? Because it's an
Yeah.
incredibly conspiratorial way of thinking about the world. I mean, maybe you're right. It's very chilling if you are right. How does, I mean, what actually happened? Did these people sit in back rooms, smoky rooms to figure all this stuff out?
Well, so for example, thinking about milk, right? There was a commitment by the government to keep dairy farmers in business and to keep the price of milk, low enough and high enough so that people would profit, and people just didn't want all that milk. So the USDA started storing it in cold storages. And then when they ran out of room, they rented half an acre of a cave in Kansas and started putting cheese in there. So they turned milk into cheese because, milk doesn't keep, and filled that floor to ceiling. And that still wasn't enough. So they had to find a way to get rid of it. And someone sat in a back room, maybe a front room. I don't know what the room looked like, but they said, you know what we can do? We can give this cheese to poor people because they're not going to be able to afford to buy it. So it won't disrupt the market price. And we can just get rid of it and solve our problems. So
that doesn't sound so bad, giving away free cheese.
It's not bad to give away free food, but what is bad is to give away food that makes people ill. And that is also what has happened with the school lunches. I mean, it is great to feed kids. We should be doing that. But it's not great to feed kids food that makes them sick and sluggish and hard for them to learn and, end up dying early from food diseases, this poor nutrition that's responsible for the highest number of preventable deaths, right? That is not good. So what happened over the century is that the food crisis changed from hunger, as you noted, to nutritional crisis, but the policies didn't change with it. The subsidies didn't change with it. By that point, the agricultural corporations had so much control over what was being subsidized that there wasn't a way to adjust it in order to keep up with people's health and nutritional needs.
But hasn't this become a controversial political issue? Michelle Obama, for example, during the Obama presidency, was very much focused on improving school lunches, that it isn't a simple state conspiracy, that the state itself is complicated, that companies are complicated, and it's not quite as simple as you're presenting.
I hope I'm not oversimplifying it. What happens is when we do see some pushback, with Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign and the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act and advances that have been made, then we see corporate pushback to get things back where they were. Or we see a change in administration, like when President Trump came in, and a lot of those policies were reversed to be more corporate friendly.
Let's go back to the origins of Washington and Jackson and your argument that these people consciously were trying to wipe out Native Americans. Are you suggesting that corporations and perhaps even the state are in a similar business today, that they're purposely feeding particularly underprivileged people bad food to wipe them out?
No. I think what we're seeing here is what we would, think about in law as, instead of intentionality, it's like an indifference, right? It's knowledge and indifference. So corporations and the USDA and all the people who are responsible for these policies know that the result is that Black people, Indigenous people, Latina people, a lot of people who have less power in society right now are suffering from these decisions because of having lower access to good food, but they just don't care. It's more important for them to make profits, and that's how corporations operate. So that makes sense for a corporation, not for a government. And so it's not that kind of conspiracy, like here's a way we're going to kill people, but it's the way we make money kills people that happens to be mostly certain populations, and we're okay with that.
When you watch television these days, Andrea, the advertisement seems to always be for fast food. Your book is the next step, perhaps, in fast food nation. Mm-hmm. But people are free. These aren't school meals. When you see ads for McDonald's or Burger King or Taco Bell or any of these other fast food companies, all the food is bad for you. It's pretty clear. But these are products of the market. No one's forcing anyone to buy them. How does that tie into your argument about the politics of food?
I think there are some people who have a lot of choice about what they eat and some people who have very little choice. So if you live in what has been referred to as a food swamp, where there's a lot of food, but all the food is, fast food outlets and other sources of food that aren't too great, like a liquor store or a convenience store, then you don't really have a choice about what you're going to eat. If that's the only thing around you and you don't have the time or the resources to go to some other neighborhood to get food, then that's what you're going to eat.
But is that a conspiracy? I mean, I don't think anyone would argue with you that that's a feature of inequality in America. But are you suggesting that corporations are somehow conspiring to do this, not to give people choice?
I think corporations would love to be the only choice that people can eat, because then
some corporations produce better food than others. I mean, Whole Foods is expensive. It's owned by Amazon. Mm-hmm. But generally, the quality of the food sold in Whole Foods is much higher than at some other food shops or at fast food companies.
But you don't see Whole Foods in the neighborhoods that I'm talking about, these food swamps, right? That's not an option. And also, of course, we all have the whole paycheck joke, right? It's not affordable for people who just don't have the budgets to be able to buy the kind of upscale products that Whole Foods offers.
So, Andrea Freeman, it's a very intriguing thesis. As you can tell, I'm slightly suspicious, although I think it's interesting. Ruin their crops on the grounds, your new book. What should be done? Are you suggesting that the only way to change this is to fundamentally restructure American capitalism? Joel Salatin wants us to get away from supermarkets and industrial farming. Nicola Twilley seems to suggest that we need to do away with refrigeration. What's your solution here?
I think we need to get corporate profits and interests out of our food policies. I think those should be totally separate. And any programs that are ostensibly designed to help people or feed people or improve nutrition should be guided by, medical, scientific, and nutritional research, and not by corporate interests.
Well, then you're doing away with any kind of lobbying, because these large food companies have large amounts of money and they're inevitably going to be trying to influence policy.
Yeah, that would be great.
And is that realistic? I mean, it's all very well saying it, but I certainly don't believe that's particularly realistic in an America where money is increasingly powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's completely unrealistic to say, let's have a USDA school lunch program that is not all about fast food or commodity surpluses. Yes, dismantling capitalism, dismantling lobbying, these are bigger goals. Or, yes, I don't know if we'll see that. But there are a lot of things we could see that I think are possible.
Bigger fish to fry, so to speak. And finally, Andrea, what about the election coming up, the Harris Trump election. I'm sure, like me, you're not a great fan of Donald Trump. Does this play itself out in the 2024 election? We don't hear much, it seems at least, about the politics of food, but is it there in the political debate?
I don't know if we're going to hear anything about it leading up to the election, but there is a new farm bill in the works that is trying to, Congress is grappling with right now. So potentially once they take that up again in September, we might see candidates talking about it. I don't know.
Well, Andrea Freeman, thank you so much. You put me off my afternoon tea. I'm not going to have milk with it because I guess I'm white, so it's probably not so bad for me, but we need to be careful with our milk, don't we?
We do. It depends which kind of white you are. So, you might be okay, but also there are delicious alternatives. Try some soy milk or some almond milk.
I'll have to go to my local, I can't say Whole Foods because that's too expensive, but maybe Safeway sell it. Well, Andrea Freeman, an honor, privilege, very interesting thesis. Best of luck with the book, and we'll do it again in the not too distant future if we both survive.
Sounds great.